You've got your outline with you. Just to show you what we've done, we've got 8 sections on this outline. We got 8 Roman numerals. Number 1 was introduction. We did 2 messages there, just to show you kind of what we've done. Number 2 was methods and materials of writing. We're still on the front of the first page. Methods and materials of writing, we did 2 messages there. Biblical languages, we did 3 there. The form of the Bible, we did 1. The canon, we did 27. The text, over on page 6, textual criticism. So you can see 2, 2, 1, 3, whatever it's been. We did 20 here on the text. The bottom of page 9, extra biblical literature, that was the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. We did 44 there. And then over on page 12, this is our last number, page 12. Translations of the Holy Scriptures, we've done 40 thus far. We spent 40 messages in the area of translation, with 29 of those just in the certain language groups. Remember, we had to start off, I think, with about 8 messages looking at a theory of translation. We did 1 introductory one, then 8, a theory of translation, and then 2 more after that. So that added up to our 11 there. So we've done 29 just in various language groups, starting with Syriac, and we just finished with Latin. Remember, we've gone from Syriac pretty much in order all the way up through Latin. So this morning we're going to be starting over on page 13, number 5, English versions, English translations. And you can just flip over the next few pages and see that will take the rest of the course then, the rest of our studies. We'll be spending the area of looking at English translations. So that's interesting to see how we've built and where, a major emphasis has been, how many tapes or messages have been preached or taught in a certain area. So by far, I guess my point in saying all this, by far we're going to have the largest number of the tapes under translations, not under textual criticism, not under canonicity. We've already had 40, and we'll probably have at least that many more just in looking at the English Bible. You can see how long that's going to take. Okay, you may want to start getting some of this list down, and I've got so much information I didn't have enough room to put all of it down, and I'll fill in what I don't have to give us our background to the English language. Okay, so we've looked at biblical languages before. A long time ago. We did, like I said, 3 messages there on Hebrew, on Aramaic, and on Greek. And some of this was given, I don't think nearly this extensive, but some of this was given with regard to the Greek language, because Greek fits here in the Indo-European family. Whenever we studied biblical Hebrew, we did the same type of diagram here, the various divisions within the Semitic family of languages. So the Indo-European languages into 2 families, the Eastern family and the Western family. The Eastern family, we've got 4 groups, subgroups, or whatever you want to call them, underneath the Eastern family. So we've got, first of all, you could have a big Roman numeral 1, you could have Indo-European languages, the Eastern family. And then number 1, the Indo-Iranian group. Not that all of this is that important, but it's going to show you, in other words, what we're looking at this for is by the time we get way down here over here to the bottom, we'll find English, what we speak today. How did we get that? Well, let's look at what it's related to. It's related to all these other languages here. It doesn't fit over in that Semitic group. We don't have these gutturals and rough breathings and things like that Hebrew and Arabic, Aramaic, these languages have. Indo-Iranian. 3 languages then fit under that group. Sanskrit, I think I left out an R. Sanskrit, Persian, and Iranian. SKR, Sanskrit, the old Indian language. Sanskrit, Persian, Iranian. Then the second group, the Thraco-Phrygian group. Thraco-Phrygian, we have Armenian. The third group, the Thraco-Illyrian. Thraco-Illyrian, we have Albanian. In other words, our English language, you see, is related to, although it's in a different family, it's over here in the Western family, but related to, and notice this is Eastern, all those Eastern European languages. Some of which are, of course, still spoken today. And Indo-European, that gets way over into India, and you get over there as Sanskrit, Persian, and Iranian. And I think I've mentioned before that Persian doesn't fit with Aramaic and Hebrew and the other Semitic tongues, but it fits with the group of European, the Indo-European languages. Then number 4, the last one here that I've listed under Eastern family, Balto-Slavic. From the Baltic Sea and the Slavs, Balto-Slavic. 9 languages fit there. I'll list those. There were too many to try to scribble on there. Balto-Slavic. Here's what we have there. Lithuanian, Prussian. I can spell these if you want me to, but I'm assuming most of you are familiar with these peoples or countries or whatever. Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czechoslovakian, CZECH, Czechoslovakian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Slovenian. 9 languages that fit under the Eastern subgroup Balto-Slavic. Lithuanian, Prussian, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czechoslovakian, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Slovenian. Okay, the Western family. This is the one we're going to be more concerned about, and we'll see more of the origins of our own language. First of all, we have the Hellenic group, represented by a language like Greek. The Hellenic group with Greek. The Italic group. Now, Latin is the important ancient member of this group. Latin is the important ancient member, but then we have, as a derivation from that, many of the later so-called Romance languages. I'm sure you've heard of that term before. Romance languages, well, these are the 5 typical Romance languages here that come from Italic, from Latin and so forth. Spanish, French, Romanian, Italian, and Portuguese. So-called Romance languages fit under this Italic group, and they come from Latin. Spanish, French, Romanian, Italian, and Portuguese. Now you can already spot some of these languages that we've dealt with, like Armenian, and we've dealt with the Slavs and Greek and Latin, and a lot of this we've already looked at. Now we're definitely getting more into our territory with numbers 3 and 4. 4 points under this first one, and 4 points here. Number 3, Celtic. The Celtic group, represented by the Welsh and Irish languages. At least there we're finally getting on the other side of the continent of Europe now. And then finally and fourthly, the Teutonic, or also they can be called or known as the Germanic. The Teutonic or the Germanic languages. The Teutonic or the Germanic languages. And they have 3 subgroups. East, represented by Gothic, and we've looked at that before. North, represented by the Old Norse, N-O-R-S-E, the Old Norse tongue. Icelandic, Swedish, and Danish. Those languages, all these languages here, in other words, are close to ours, because our language it's a Germanic, it's a Teutonic tongue. So all of these languages mentioned, whether it's under A, B, or C, and particularly those under C, are going to be close to ours. Etymologically, anyway, close to ours. Maybe not in pronunciation or vocabulary or syntax, but etymologically. Old Norse, Icelandic, Swedish, and Danish. And then the third and final subgroup of the Teutonic Germanic group, the Western, or the West group. And then I have a lot to say under these two, High German and Low German. It wouldn't all fit on here, though. As long as you get all that, then you can start working underneath these two, High German and Low German. And these two developed, the Western group of High German and Low German developed so many sub-languages themselves. That's probably why it's also known as Germanic tongue instead of, Gothic, Teutonic Gothic, or Teutonic Danish is Teutonic Germanic, because the German language has had such a profound influence on so many other sub-languages which have, in some way or another, evolved from that. Now, High German began around AD 600 in southern Germany with a shift in consonantal sounds. If you wonder how a language ever begins, we'll just move to Dixie and you'll find out how a language can begin. You get a certain group of people that begin pronouncing things just a little bit differently. And you get those people to move somewhere else or get them somehow isolated from the Yankees up north, and if you just give yourself enough time, a few hundred years, you'll have an entirely different language then. I mean, it'll be related because one served as the basis or as the origin for the other. But I'm saying that High German began from other languages in its locale just by a shift in consonantal pronunciation. You pronounce your consonants in a different fashion, and all of a sudden you have a different language, and then you get isolated from those other people as time goes on, and then you have an entirely new vocabulary. And then you may have words that look the same that aren't the same because they're pronounced differently and because they just come from different words entirely because you have a completely different vocabulary than these people had. So that's how languages begin. It's not like one man just wakes up speaking in a new tongue or something and goes and teaches other people that. You've somehow got to get a whole indigenous group of people to begin to speak that and somehow separate them from those people from whom they had gotten their first tongue in order to get another tongue, which is, it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, you really can't just say, let's go invent a new language, because you got to convince enough people around you to speak it to make it self-perpetuating, because once you die and your family dies, the language will die. Of course, that's what's so remarkable about Hebrew, to have been a dead language, essentially a dead language for so long, and to have been revived so that you can force, and really it's a willing forcing of the people, so many people, to speak a language that nobody really knows, Hebrew. Of course, as we've studied in biblical Hebrew, that's unique in the history of languages of mankind. For a language to die and be gone that long and to get a whole nation to speak that again. And I've said before, just try to force everyone in the United States. We're just going to force you to, well, we don't have to go to languages. Let's just go to measurements. We're going to switch to the metric system. And people just won't do it, They're going to fight the old way. So it has to be God, I believe, for a group of people, and it just happens to be the Jews. Why was it the Jews and not the Spaniards or the Russians or something? To have a language revived like that and to speak that tongue again. So this begins to develop High German with a shift in consonantal sounds and pronunciation somewhere around AD 600, and then the language begins to move from southern Germany. It starts in southern Germany, by the way, up into the northern parts of Germany. And by the time it reached northern Germany, this change died out. Now you can just go into lots of details, but we're not going to do that. Let me just try to oversimplify everything for you. So here it died out in what we call the so-called lowlands. I don't want to spend a lot of time drawing maps again up here, but let's just give ourselves, a rough look, and it's very rough of. Well, if you recognize Italy, so I've got to draw Italy right, or Ireland. All right, and so we go up here. All right, and so and let's give ourselves, because we're going to need this here eventually. That's probably way too big, but give ourselves Great Britain over there. Okay, we're talking about Germany, right here. And so it starts down here in southern Germany, High German. It begins to move up here to northern Germany, but northern Germany is referred to as the lowlands. Just because of the terrain. Up here when you get into Belgium and the Netherlands, it's referred to as the Low Countries or the lowlands. That's why the names seem to be swapped up. You'd think High German, Low German, that somehow High German would go with the northern territory because north is high, and Low German would go with the south. That's why I'm explaining this, because it's easy to confuse in your mind. No, High German goes with the south because territorially or geographically the land is higher there, so it's High German. A lot of people think High German means it's a more elevated way of speaking German or something because it's High German. Well, no, it just has to do with where the language evolved, where it developed. Whereas Low German develops up here in the north because territorially it's the low lands, because you're getting up on, your northern seas there. So it moved north, and it's called Low German whenever it gets up north, and it's called High German whenever it's down south. Okay, let's look at High German, as you still got on your outline there. Some of the languages produced by High German. High German. Okay, first of all, there's Old High German, which was the original language that came about around AD 600. Old High German. Then that produced also Bavarian, B-A-V-A, Bavarian. Middle High German. And then what we have today is just plain German. We're going to see the same thing with English. English today is just plain English. But there were some olds and lows and middles and all of this as well. Old High German, Bavarian, Middle High German, and today we have German, which is a High German language. Okay, Low German. This should have us all the way off the chart now. Low German. We have Old Saxon, S-A-X-O-N, that also has another name. It can also be called Old Low German. So right away you can see there's an immediate connection between the Saxon tongue and the Germanic languages. Old Saxon, also known as Old Low German, to distinguish it from Old High German. Then you just have plain Low German. Dutch, Flemish, Anglo-Saxon, that can also be called, and we may deviate from calling it Anglo-Saxon by using this other term. It may also be called Old English. Old English. You're familiar with Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales. You see, that's not Old English there. Many times it's referred to as Old English. But Old English is Anglo-Saxon, and you would really not even hardly be able to understand. Although Chaucer is difficult to understand, you would really not hardly be able to even understand it, Anglo-Saxon or Old English. That's really Middle English there. And that's what comes next. Middle English, and then English, which is what we speak. And of course, if you read Chaucer, any of the other writings around that period of time, if you've looked at a Wycliffe Bible, or a copy of a Wycliffe Bible, which also comes out around the same time as Geoffrey Chaucer's writings, you'll see how difficult it is to read and to understand. And generally what we want is some English form, and all that was Middle English. That was just the parent to our language right now, the immediate parent to our language now. We can hardly even read it. Have you read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales? No, that's why I'm not getting any response. Nobody's read it. Well, anyway, it's one of those things you have to read in school. I forget what grade. Maybe it's in college, and that's why you haven't read it, because you didn't go. But it's difficult to read, and it's just English, but it's Middle English and not plain English like we have plain English today. Just the way things are spelled and everything, and the way things are pronounced are so radically different. So to make sure you have those, Old Saxon, also called Old Low German. Low German, Dutch, Flemish, Anglo-Saxon, also called Old English, Middle English, and English. I think some people call it Old English because when you just start off with middle, you wonder where the first part of it was, where the beginning was. If we have English today, that must be the final end, and then we've got Middle English. Where was the first one? Well, the first one was Anglo-Saxon, but it can also be called Old English. So, you see that English is sort of a tail-end language specimen. I mean, it's the last thing. English, as we speak it today, fits at the very tail end of this long list that I just gave you up here. But although it's kind of a tail-end language specimen today, it also happens to be the world's dominant tongue that's spoken throughout the world today. So that's remarkable for it to be such a late and really inferior development of this whole process of languages here. And I mean inferior in so many different regards. And we've discussed some of those before, how you can have the same spelling for entirely different words, same pronunciation, different spelling for entirely different types of words, whether it's reading or whether it's writing. You know, you're listening to something being read to you. It's easy to confuse. And words that are so ambiguous that you really couldn't tell the difference from. And the way you go from a present to a past tense in verbs, I mean, he left and I died and they went. I mean, look at the way you form past tenses of all those. Where's the similarity there? How would you know to go from from a present tense to a past tense in cases like that? Well, it's easy for us because we've studied it for years and years and years, and we've lived around other people who speak it, and we might not even be able to tell now, well, what is the present tense of went? What is that? Well, you might not know, but whenever it comes time to say it, you'll know the right word to say, though. And you couldn't explain. How do you go from I died to I died, and you go from he goes to they went? I mean, what's the relation between go and went? None of the letters are even the same. But yet you can go from a present to a past tense. So it's very irregular. It's a very inferior language. All you have to do is study one of these other languages and you'll see how beautiful they are. Although they all have their inadequacies in them, there's always exceptions to languages. Probably English would have to take the hat in that area. But even though it's a late language and an inferior language, it's certainly become the dominant language in the modern world. And I guess we could probably also say, there have been more English translations of the Bible, more translations of the Scriptures into the English language than probably any other language. So that, and especially in the 20th century, and I mean major ones, not just where an individual sat down and did a private copy. You could have had all different types of Old Latin or Latin copies with thousands of different variants. But I mean where a major group of people or a publishing company or something does an English translation, an English Bible. And we just have scores and scores, yes, even hundreds of them that are available today just in the English tongue. So a late development, maybe a black sheep in the family of the Indo-European languages, but certainly came out on top in the long run, though. So it's developed itself, through these early Saxon forms, and I think the development of the English language through and from the early Saxon forms more or less parallels the development of Christianity in Great Britain. And that's what we want to look at next. We want to look at the history of Christianity in Great Britain. Remember, we've done this with the other family groups as well, because we have to know something about the origin of the introduction of Christianity into that area before we have need of a Bible translation in that tongue. There's really no need to have a Bible in the English language until we have the message of Christianity imported onto the island of Great Britain. So let's look a little at the introduction. That's all we're going to look at this morning. And it shouldn't take us that long. The introduction of Christianity into Great Britain. Now, Christianity happens to be introduced a long, long time before we ever have a Bible translation. That is like some of the other family languages that we've discussed, but it's unlike others, such as Syriac. Christianity is introduced and the Bible's translated right away. But here, we're going to have a difference, and we'll show you the reason why. Okay, the Celts were the first Indo-European people to settle the island of Britain. And by the way, the ancient name of the country is Britain. I mean, during this period in history. Britain. The people are Britons, spelled with an O-N-S. Britons. But they're pronounced the same. Britain is the name of the country, and Britons the name of the people in the country. And it doesn't receive the name England until later. And of course today, I guess it goes by both names. It goes by Britain, it goes by Great Britain, it goes by England. It even goes by the British Isles. You've heard of that phrase before, the British Isles, which includes Scotland and Ireland as well. This this introduction of the Celtic people took place around the time, to give you a biblical framework in which to think and work, of King David. The Celts were the first Indo-European people to settle the island of Britain somewhere around the time of King David. Now, any earlier than that's not important for us. You could go all the way back to the time of the post-Diluvian days, and who and when and why did certain people settle after the time of Noah. But we just want to get some Indo-European people there, the Celts, and that's going to be important because the Celtic language was the important language there, and the church was even referred to for centuries as the Celtic Church. Although, what country do you think of when you think of Celts, though? The Irish people, Ireland. But you see, in one sense, Ireland is really part of Britain today, England today. That's why it's called the British Isles. The British Isles, but yet Britain is just the low part, and then you have Scotland up higher, the same island. Then you have Ireland over to the west of that, and yet it's all the British Isles. Because Britain kind of, well, she's been the dominant. Certainly, Great Britain has been the dominant one of those three, what used to be three countries. Their culture, the culture of the Celts, was related to the Gauls back on the continent. Under Julius Caesar, the Romans attempted to invade and conquer Britain in 55 BC. That's how far Julius Caesar had gone from home base. But he failed. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar failed in his attempt to invade and to conquer Great Britain. And as a result of that, the Romans were kept out of the British Isles for 100 years, for a century after that. And it wasn't until under Claudius in AD 43 that Britain fell to Rome. Now, whenever the Romans came in, they replaced the old Druid form of worship. D-R-U-I-D. Have you ever heard of that before? The Druid high priests and the Druid worship. Well, that's all tied into Ireland and the Celts, you know. We can look at that maybe some other time. It was an interesting form. Oh, it's a false religion, obviously. The Druid high priest and so forth, but the Druid religion was wiped out of England, and the Roman religion was introduced, which was a religion of many gods. And Rome remained until around AD 410. So she stays there about 4 centuries. Rome occupying Great Britain. Stays there until around AD 410, whenever the last group of troops is finally pulled out by the Roman government to help make a last-ditch effort to save the empire back in Italy. Remember, the Roman Empire falls in 476 AD. So the Roman Empire is definitely on the decline. We're during the times of the invasions of the Vandals in Rome around 410, and Augustine is writing his City of God around 410. And Augustine, and by the way, we're going to be discussing 2 different Augustines. Sometimes they are differentiated by their pronunciation, one being referred to as Augustine and the other as Augustine. Although I generally call both of them by the same name, Augustine. But one is a missionary to England, the other is a great bishop and church writer in Hippo near Carthage in North Africa. So the Roman Empire is going under. It will have been sacked and routed completely and entirely just 66 years from this time. So those Roman soldiers, in other words, that were garrisoned or stationed in Britain are needed back in Italy to make a last-ditch effort to revive the empire and keep the invading barbarians out. Of course, that fails. They last for another 66 years, and the Roman Empire falls in AD 476. So whenever they're pulled out, well, a new group of people are going to come in. I don't think we want to get into that yet. We'll get into that next week. But just remember that the Romans stay from the time of Claudius in AD 43 for about 400 years into the beginning of the 5th century AD, around the year 410. They're going to be pulled out. An invading group of people will come in. The local Britons then will ask for help from the continent, from 3 different groups of people there. the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. We'll get into that later. They come in, invade the country, overrun the land. Christianity is suppressed, and then some of the missionaries are sent in to reintroduce Christianity into the land of Britain. But that will be our topic the next time we study biblical literature. So the church in Britain, which is not called England until later, up until, let's say, the middle of the 5th century, which is really the date for the Saxon invasion, is called the Celtic Church. It's the Celtic Church speaking, sometimes the Celtic tongue, but the majority of the writing is done in Latin. Latin is the empire-wide dominant language. But it will be important later on to know that the church was a Celtic church and it has Celtic origins. Not Anglo or Saxon origins, because they are the barbarous invaders that come from the continent and invade Great Britain whenever, well, not really invade, they're asked to come in and help deliver the local British people from the Picts and the Scots who had come in after the Romans had pulled out their last troops. Okay, now here are the references we have to the introduction of Christianity into Great Britain. First of all, we have the English historian William Malmesbury gives us an interesting statement. William Malmesbury, M-A-L-M-E-S-B-U-R-Y. William Malmesbury, who lived 1090 to 1143. He wrote a work in 1135 entitled On the Antiquity of the Church of Glastonbury. On the Antiquity of the Church of Glastonbury. One of the oldest and most influential monasteries in Great Britain. And in this 1135 work, he had the following comment to make. Malmesbury said that in AD 63, just 20 years after the Romans invaded and conquered the land, that Philip, this is Philip of the New Testament, Philip had Joseph of Arimathea leave Gaul, where he had been a missionary, and go to Britain as a missionary to these local British, or really Celtic people. So if that's true, which again it reads like one of those legends, what happened to the 12 apostles, you know. And books have been written on that and stories told, and how much of it is reliable is not really known. Much of it is disputable, and here we're outside of the band of the 12 apostles. They even tagged Joseph of Arimathea to be a missionary as well. But if it's true, that means Christianity would have been in the British Isles sometime during the last half of the 1st century A.D., which is very early. If you know that we're talking about Palestine being way over here, you know, and we're going all the way up here to Great Britain. But anyway, according to Malmesbury, I mean, he's just, if you want to know, where he gets this, he's just recording a legend that's been passed down, an oral legend that's been passed down of, how did Christianity come to our nation? It's obviously a Christian nation, quote unquote, by 1135, by the time William Malmesbury is writing this work. So how did it become a Christian nation? Well, according to local legend and lore and tradition, and you want to have some contact with, the original people in Palestine, because that makes your church and your Christianity seem to be more valid. And if you know that somebody's got Peter stuck down in Rome all the time, you can't claim Peter, so you have to find someone else to claim. And by this time, everybody else has got one of the apostles claimed. So Joseph of Arimathea, no one's claimed him yet, so we'll claim him. Yeah, that's really the way that it works. You want to attach your church to the name of some famous figure. And people do it today. Lutheranism, they want to attach their church to the name of some important figure to give, validity to their group or to their church. And so that's just the way that it's been done. Another source of information we have that definitely is more reliable than Malmesbury, because look how late Malmesbury is writing, is Tertullian. Tertullian, writing in around AD 200, in the 7th chapter of his work entitled Answer to the Jews, he's arguing for the fact that all the world is embracing the spread of Christianity. Now he's not, Tertullian is using a different form of argument now against adversaries than Malmesbury would be, or other people who would use the argument, let's claim a great figure as the fountainhead of our church or our movement or our group, and that would add credibility to our group then. Tertullian goes for the bigger the better idea, numbers involved here. Well, the whole world is embracing Christianity, that must mean that it's right. Well, in the 7th century A.D., almost the whole world embraced the Islamic faith as well. So I don't think that's a very valid thing, but it's used for apologetical purposes, though, and in that case, I guess it is valid. But that doesn't prove Christianity is right, because most of the world is embracing it. You have to have a better basis than that. But that would at least open the door for argument between the Christians and the Jews. So anyway, listen to what he's explaining, what the context is, and I'll give you his quote here. He's arguing against the Jews. You know, the Jews are saying Christianity is a hybrid false religion. And Tertullian is saying, well, why or how could you say that? The whole world is embracing our religion, and the whole world has not embraced your religion. He refers to Acts 2, verses 9 through 11. What are those verses about? Acts 2, 9 to 11. All the people, list all those different nations there. Remember that? All right, so this is interesting that he's going to tie in Great Britain, going to tie that in, make a connection between that and Acts 2, 9 to 11. After referring to that, he goes on with other examples of other nations in the world that had experienced, let's say, Pentecost or Christianity. And he says this, and I quote, he gives a long list, and I just lifted this out of there. The halts, H-A-U-N-T-S, the halts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. Now, that's a very interesting and very important reference in Tertullian. Answer to the Jews, chapter 7. After mentioning Acts 2, 9 to 11, he goes on and gives other examples that aren't listed in those nations there. And he says the halts of the Britons, in other words, Christianity has come to the halts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Romans, but subjugated to Christ. Now you see his reference is probably to the fact that in 55 BC, Julius Caesar attempted to invade the land and failed. The great Roman general, the great Roman leader, Julius Caesar, attempted to invade the land of Britain and failed. I mean, he says inaccessible to the Romans. Remember, Tertullian is writing A.D. 200. Who's in control of Great Britain? The Romans are, ever since A.D. 43. But you go back 55 B.C., and he probably has a reference to the fact that the great leader of the Romans, Caesar, Julius Caesar, could not conquer Britain. But the great leader of the Christian church, Jesus Christ, was able to subjugate the people. That probably is what he means. It's a sly reference there. And you have to know history. What does he mean, inaccessible to the Romans? Since during the time Tertullian is writing, Rome has been in control of England for 200 years. So he's got to have some sneaky reference to something. And it would be my guess that he has a reference to Caesar's failure to conquer the people. So that's telling us that by the time of Tertullian, AD 200, Christianity must be firmly entrenched in Great Britain. It has to be for him to make a reference like this. And he's writing way down here in North Africa, remember. He's down there with Augustine and Cyprian, the three great North African church writers and fathers. And how does he know that what's going way on up here, unless it's just well known that England is a Christian country by this time? I copied down a quote from another man, John T. McNeill. He had a comment about Tertullian's statement here. You can't get all of this down, but you can listen to it, though. Because we want to know, how reliable is the statement in Tertullian? Is this really reliable, what he's telling us? Should we take it with a grain of salt or a bucket of salt or what? McNeill writes, allowing for the exuberance of Tertullian, we must also remember that he was one of the best informed persons of his time. His comment may well represent a report he had heard from a Christian traveler, conceivably one who had been himself displaced from somewhere in the Scottish lowlands where the Romans had then recently lost a wide territory to the Picts, P-I-C-T-S. The Picts are going to be the important ones along with the Scots who invade England as soon as the Romans pull out in AD 410, and that'll be our topic next time. So he says, allowing for the exuberance of Tertullian, that people can tend to exaggerate, we must also remember that he was one of the best informed persons of his time. His comment may well represent a report he had heard from a Christian traveler, because Tertullian certainly doesn't travel up here. We know about his life. He's down here, down in North Africa. How does he hear? Someone has to come to him. Conceivably one who had been himself displaced from somewhere in the Scottish lowlands, where the Romans had then recently lost a wide territory to the Picts. Then a third reference we have to the early introduction to Christianity is found in Origen. In his homilies, chapter 4, section 1 on Ezekiel. Origen's homilies, chapter 4, section 1 on Ezekiel, writing around AD 250, said that Christianity was a force of unification for all men in Britain. Origen's also writing from North Africa. Well, by this time he's probably up in Caesarea, but he was from Egypt, Alexandria, remember. Christianity was a force of unification for all men in Britain. Now, both of these last two remarks from Tertullian and Origen kind of come in the form of rhetorical questions or rhetorical statements. So I think that you have to, some measure of exaggeration may have to be taken into account. But even so, even assuming that, even as McNeill said, allowing for the exuberance of Tertullian, no less an important and famous church historian than Adolf Harnack himself, which he was a liberal, but one of the best-known modern church historians, said that Christianity was in Britain at least by the end of the 2nd century. I mean, at least no later than 190 AD. No later than that, at least by the end of the 2nd century AD. And most definitely by the early 4th century it had spread widely. But we think that those two comments may be too conservative. By that I mean giving us a little too late of a date for the introduction as well as the widespread. It's at least by this time, and at least by this time, Christianity is either there or it's spreading widely among the people. Remember that we are an English people here. The founders of this country didn't come from Germany. Now your parents might have come from Germany because we've kind of become the melting pot for the whole world, but this country was founded by English people. Now, you might not be English. You might have a German heritage on one side and maybe a Scottish on the other side, or an Irish on the other side or something, but basically we're English people. We speak English. We live in New England. That's the old England over there. We even live in a place called New England. That's why it was named that, by the way, New England. And even if you aren't directly related to some English person, most of the people in this country are. In other words, that was the foundation for our country. So, it's interesting to know where our mother country came into contact with Christianity then, to know something about Great Britain. We know when this country came into contact with it, and that was just a couple of years ago. I mean, in comparison, because nobody even knew about this country except those red men with long black hair for a long, long time. So just a couple of years ago when this country found out about Christianity. And that's a whole study in itself. The form of Christianity that was introduced into this country was a Puritan form of Christianity, which is a very well, in our beliefs, a very biblical form of Christianity. I mean, the Puritans were leaving the old liturgical hierarchy and practices of the Anglican Church, and they got their name from the Angles, some of the people who invaded England, back in Great Britain, back in England, and brought what they thought was a purer form of Christianity, a more primitive, pristine New Testament, apostolic, Book of Acts form. And of course, we think that they were right, certainly in their tendencies to lean away from all of the liturgy and all of the structures and the stratosphere of the church in England, and give us something that's down to earth, that's homey without being homely. The Puritan ministers were highly, highly educated men, They were the number one source of information for the people. Today it's newspapers and TV, you know. Back then, if you ever wanted to learn anything, you had to go to church, because the Puritan ministers were well-read, not just in biblical topics, but you read some of their writings, and they were geologists and scientists and mathematicians and astronomers, as well as biblical scholars and theologians. And what a difference that would make in our world if the source of Christians' information were their pastors. So they would hear everything, even if it was something secular, from a Christian point of view. I just read a recent article about that ties in beautifully with what we're studying. It's just, they were saying that's one of the tragedies of American Christianity now, is Christians don't look to their ministers as a source of their information. They look to television, magazines, newspapers, and they go to all of that and hear things from a non-Christian perspective then. Of course, it's we live in a different world now, there's no doubt about that. But in those days, without the wireless and without all of this material being shoved in your mailbox or whatever, you knew that if you wanted to learn about God or your world or yourself, you had to go to the Lord's house on the Sabbath day, as the Puritans would think. And you'd get a little message from scriptures, and you might get some tidbits in astronomy and geography as well. Because the only people who knew anything in the community were the ministers. They were the only ones trained. Everyone else, it was you worked from when the sun came up till when it went down. That's just what you had to do to make a living, fighting off Indians and bars and all those things. That's how you made a living, kept yourself alive and the people in your home alive. So you don't have time to go turn on the boob tube and sit down and watch a little while. Time to split wood now. Go run your trap line. Well, you can kind of, just in describing that to you, you can kind of picture that in your mind. You can see the cabins and those old Puritan meeting houses, old hard benches, and you'd come. But those men were not ignoramuses. They were the most intelligent men in the English colonies here, were the Puritan ministers. And now you see we have these, that even the term puritanical now has negative connotations to it. And maybe in some regards it should. They had funny notions, I guess, especially in the area of sexual mores. And generally that's where the term puritanical pops up. But the Puritans were, you read John Owen, he's the first one that would obviously come to anyone's mind as a famous Puritan writer. I've got his work, 16 volumes, about this much. 16 volumes by this man who lived out in the woods somewhere, John Owen. But highly educated. One of the most difficult, I haven't even gotten into it yet, because he's one of the most difficult readers to read. One of the most difficult ones to follow. So a great reader and expounder of the scriptures in the Sunday morning services, and a great writer of that as well during the week, I guess. But he's hard to follow because he's so educated. All right, somehow, let's get back on track here. I was just trying to make you appreciate the fact now you know something of the origin of Christianity in your motherland.
Yeah. Oh.
And then you have to skip, 1,600 years to come up with the origin of Christianity in this land. And I think just the form of our early Christianity was certainly a more biblical form than what we have today. So we've said that by the early 4th century it spread widely. The church was of sufficient scope to send 3 bishops, the church in Great Britain, to the Synod of Arles in AD 314. So that's early 4th century. This is one of our proofs, knowing that it had spread widely, that the church in Great Britain was of sufficient scope to send 3 bishops to the Synod of Arles, A-R-L-E-S, in AD 314. Perhaps representing the cities of London, York, and Lincoln, although that's not provable. Who was if anyone can recall, who was the most famous the earliest outstanding church writer from Great Britain? No? Where's Athanasius come from? Athanasius is related to the bishops down in Alexandria, Egypt. The earliest outstanding church writer from Britain was one Pelagius. Pelagius, the British monk and church writer, who also happened to be a heretic. So Britain has the dubious distinction of producing as its first outstanding leader a heretical one at that. But Britain itself lived untainted by the heresies of the 4th century. You've got all of these important church councils that are taking place. Nicaea in 325 dealt with the heresy of Arianism. What else do we have? 325, the Council of, what's the next one? Constantinople in 381. Now, those are the two big councils. You've got four early important councils there. Two in the 4th century, Nicaea in 325, Constantinople in 381, and then two important ones in the 5th century, Ephesus in 431 and Chalcedon in 451. You've got more important councils after that. But those are the two first major important, what we call ecumenical councils. And the Protestants accept so many of them. Like the first four, pretty much the Protestants, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Roman Catholics accept. The first 7, the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox accept. And the Catholics officially have it at 21. They go all the way up through 21 ecumenical councils that they recognize. But most Protestants only recognize the first couple of those 21. So we know that important heresies, in other words, are taking place in other parts of the empire, in other parts of the Mediterranean world in the 4th century. And although Pelagius comes from England, he's a 4th century British monk and scholar, and he is a heretic, England itself, Great Britain itself, pretty much lives untainted by the heretical controversies of the Mediterranean world that are swirling around these two important councils, Nicaea, Nicaea in 325, and Constantinople in 381. Pelagianism didn't touch Great Britain until the early 5th century, although Pelagius, as I've said, was a 4th century writer. Pelagianism did not touch Great Britain until the early 5th century, around 421. Now, do you know what Pelagianism is, or was? Augustine was the great opponent of Pelagianism. Well, what can I say without getting myself in a hole that I won't be able to dig myself out of in 10 minutes or so? We'll talk to me later. Well, it concerns sovereignty and human freedom. I mean, to simplify it, Augustine was on the sovereignty side. He believed that that man was in chains and bondage to sin now, ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, and there's nothing he can do himself to get out of it. If God is willing and gracious enough to send down grace and faith to him, then he can repent and return to God, but not until that. Whereas Pelagius was more on the human freedom, definitely more on the human freedom side, that man still had something in him where he could repent and he wasn't dependent upon the sovereignty of God. The old posse peccari et posse non peccari thing, where Augustine held it was just posse peccari. It's possible for man to sin. And it's not until after one has experienced grace and has experienced redemption in Jesus Christ will we ever get back to the pre-fall, the Edenic state of Adam and Eve before their fall, the posse peccari et posse non peccari. It's possible for man to sin. It's possible for man not to sin also. Those are Latin terms, you see, that they use to explain the state of Adam and Eve in the garden, the state of fallen man since sin, and the state of the redeemed Christian after that, and the state of the next life, if you want to do all four of them. But anyway, that's what Pelagianism was. It was the old form of human freedom as it attempted to oppose the sovereignty of God. He wrote commentaries on the epistles of Paul. Now, it's still not time for English translations, however. We've got Christianity here. We're all the way up into, well, I said Pelagianism finally touched it around 421. We're up into the first quarter of the 5th century A.D. Still no Bible translations. That is because all of Western Christendom, including Britain, did their theological writings at that time in Latin, including Pelagius, although they may have spoken a different tongue. They all did their theological writings in the theological language of the world, which was Latin, all of Western Christendom. So we see that the Christian church flourishes greatly in Britain from at least the 2nd century until the mid-5th century. No translating work was done, to our knowledge anyway, during this period. Christianity flourished greatly in Britain from at least the 2nd century until the mid-5th century. But what was it that changed all of this? Well, it was a tremendous invasion of the country by the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons. And we're going to stop there this morning, and we'll pick up with that next time. We'll look at the pulling out of the Roman troops, the invasion of the Picts and the Scots, and then the second invasion by the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons, and what that did to Christianity, which had been entrenched now for 4 centuries in Great Britain. What it did to Christianity negatively, of course, and how the religion was able to survive the onslaught of the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons, who, of course, were all pagans from the continent. Okay, do you have any questions on that? The introduction of Christianity into Great Britain, preparing us to look at the translations. But we have no need thus far. Christianity's been there 400 years, but all the writing in Western Christendom is done in the Latin tongue, the theological writing, including that by heretics like Pelagius, and Augustine himself wrote in Latin. We won't have until several hundred years later. I mean, one of these that's going to have to happen, and it's going to start this process, is the downfall of the Roman Empire. With the downfall of the Roman Empire, so goes down the Latin tongue as well. And also, when you have your country invaded by all of these pagans here, introducing new forms of worship and driving all the Christians from all over the island of Britain way over to the western shore and almost pushing them literally into the Atlantic Ocean, then it's time to start fighting back and doing something about it and trying to leave some heritage for people after you. And the way to do that is leave that in written form. And with the Roman Empire going down the tube and the Latin language going down with it, you know you're going to have to write in some other language for your posterity. And the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons are some of the very ones who introduce a new language. Remember, we've had a Celtic church up until this time. Celtic and Latin-speaking people in Great Britain. And with the introduction of these invading marauders, we're going to have the introduction of their tongue as well, which is what's going to persevere through all of these centuries in Great Britain and is carried over to our country as well. Yes?
On this Pelagianism, is with the in the hyper-faith movement of the teaching that, you know, you got to go out and get people saved, get them to pray a prayer of faith and receive Jesus, and they're teaching that you can just get anybody saved. Would that be a form of Pelagianism?
Well, they certainly have that mentality in the way they deal with that. Charismatics and Pentecostals, we can start with the Assemblies of God, founded in Little Rock, Arkansas back in 1914. First major Pentecostal denomination that's lasted so long. The Assemblies of God and all Pentecostals, and I guess it has to do with the emphasis on the personal life you have with God and the personal walk that you have with Him, have tended to be Arminians, which is, a later, it's a Reformation type development of some of the themes of Pelagius and other people during his period of time. Technically, Pelagianism and Arminianism are not the same thing, but they're in the same ballpark. It's a sovereignty and human freedom ballpark that we're talking about there. And so historically, and this is one thing we just have noted among charismatics and Pentecostals, historically, they're a very human freedom-centered group of people. And I think that has to do with the fact that they're so experience-oriented and so experience-related, that they're basing everything on human freedom. They're back to that all the time. And sovereignty, I guess maybe to them that sounds too much like dictatorship, that might sound too much to them like ecclesiastical authority, that might sound too much to them like denominationalism or something. And so they tend to revolt against that.
How do you spell his name?
Pelagius, Pelagius, I believe. Pelagius.
So who came first, Armenia or
Pelagianism. Pelagianism is coming in the 4th century. And Arminianism is a Reformation era discussion between people like Calvin and Jacob Arminius, who was a Dutch scholar and theologian. And from that we get Calvin's so-called TULIP, the acronym TULIP, T-U-L-I-P, that stands for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement. What's I? P is perseverance of the saints. I, irresistible grace. That's how you're supposed to remember all that. It's TULIP. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. They coined that little acronym TULIP so you could remember all those things. See, I couldn't remember them without T-U-L-I-P, and that gives you the first letter to all of them.